Okay, so I think I will just start with the introduction. My name is Owen Dowsett. I am a senior consultant in social enterprise at the British Council. And today we are bringing you a webinar which will be looking at inclusive impact investment and social finance in the context of COVID-19. Thank you so much to everybody that is joining. As you will hopefully be aware, there is a particular focus of this on countries within the Africa, Caribbean and Pacific regions. And I'm pleased to say we've got people registered from Ghana, from Trinidad and Tobago, from Mauritius, from Sierra Leone, from the Bahamas, and all sorts of interesting places. So thank you so much for joining. And I realise that the time zones probably won't have worked too much in some of your favours. So thank you for joining if it's especially early morning or in the evening. Yes, this is part of a series of webinars which are delivered by the Investment and Climate Reform Facility, which you'll be hearing a little bit more about later. For the moment, I guess it's just for me to highlight to you that this session is being recorded and it will be available for download, or the presentation will be available for download at the end of the session. Hopefully you are all kind of getting to grips with the navigation panel, which should be on the right side of your screen. There are options there to drop down menu around chat and questions, and that in one of those there will be the information to download also later towards the end of the session. So in terms of questions, there will be a couple of opportunities for questions during today's session. We will be having a short 10-minute or so break in the middle. And that will be an opportunity to ask especially any kind of clarification questions that you have from the first half of the session, but it will also be an opportunity to go and refill your drinks, or to find a little bit more out about the ICR facility and what opportunities there are for you. And then at the end of the session, we will also give plenty of time for some questions and answers. And hopefully, I do hope that there are lots of them. So please do keep a note of anything that comes to mind when you hear from the speakers today. And I'm pleased to say we have such an esteemed panel of speakers from around the Africa, Caribbean and Pacific regions. And I'm not going to welcome them specifically here by giving their biographies, but people will further down the line. So please do stick around to hear from them. There should be some great points made and discussions had. So just to run quickly through the agenda, we will firstly be hearing from Irene Danquah, who works for the British Council and specifically has involvement in the Investment Climate Reform Facility. She will just be giving you a little bit of background about that. I will then remind us of the aims and objectives for the session and introduce the two key facilitators for today, who are Bonnie Chiu and Sarah Jane. Sorry, Sarah Jane, Sarah Jane Danchie, apologies, who both belong to the Social Investment Consultancy. And they will then be running us through the rest of the session, which is going to include a bit of background information about the topic of today, as well as facilitating some panel discussion. And we will have a break in the middle, as I mentioned. We'll have a Q&A session, especially at the end, and then we'll draw it to a close with some conclusions, some takeaways, and information about what to do next. I will also say, in terms of questions, you can either ask them through the questions section, which you should have in your navigation panel, or you can ask them through the chat function, which hopefully you've also discovered. Now, I do think there's going to be a quick poll now, just for us to get a sense of what sort of organisations and sectors you come from. So please do take a moment to give your answers there. It's a multiple response question, so hopefully it shouldn't be too difficult, but I know there's lots of overlap in these sorts of things, so whatever suits you best. Okay, and we'll just leave that to run for 15 or so seconds, and then I will be passing to Irene Danquah, who, as I said, works for the British Council, but also for the Investment Climate Reform Facility, through which this webinar is provided. So I'm going to leave it to the people in charge of the slides to decide when we have enough responses on the poll. And then it will be over to Irene. Hi, Irene.
All right, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are joining us for this 10th webinar the ICR response. So my duty is to provide more information on the Investment Climate Reform Facility, which you will usually hear ICR Facility. So this facility is a project being sponsored by the European Union together with the Organization for African, Caribbean and Pacific States under the 11th EDF Partnership Agreement, and it's also being co-financed by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as the British Council. The project is being implemented together by 4 organizations. So these 4 organizations are bringing their expertise together to deliver this project, and they include GIZ, British Council, SNV, and Expertise France. The aim of the project, or what the project is seeking to do, is to support public and private stakeholders in the ACP to improve their business environment and investment climate. What we intend to do is that by providing technical assistance to these stakeholders, they will be able to create a conducive, inclusive, and sustainable business environment that will support businesses to grow, and that will lead to sustainable and inclusive economy, and will also lead to jobs in the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific states. We are doing this in 3 levels. So the first level, which I'll come back to, is we are providing technical assistance for business environment and investment climate reform initiative. I'll speak on that shortly. The second one is we are strengthening national and sub-regional development financial institutions with technical assistance with capacity building programs. And the third one, which this webinar falls under, is we are sharing best practices. We are compiling these best practices and we are sharing it with the public and private stakeholders, because we believe that by sharing these best practices, or by learning from these public and private stakeholders, we can all together create a more conducive and a more sustainable business environment and investment climate. And this webinar is one of the activities that we are using to do that. Now back to the first thing that we are doing, the first area that we are working on. In the first area, which you see the slide on, we are providing technical assistance to business environment initiative or investment climate initiative in the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific region. So if you are a public or private stakeholder and you have the right eligibility, we will be sharing the fact sheet so you can check if you are eligible and you are conducting any business environment reform. That is, if a business environment reform, example, business registration, tax policy, business and investment policy, you are undertaking any of this initiative and you need technical assistance, we are here to provide that support to you. All you need to do is to send in a request, and once we check the eligibility and we assess it, and if it is approved, we will then dedicate 90 days of our consultants' time to provide this technical assistance to you. We are also seeking to strengthen public-private dialogue, because we believe that by the public and private having that conversation and deciding what is best for the business environment, we can create sustainable business environment. So if you also want us to strengthen your public-private dialogue, or you want us to create systems or processes of how you engage, if you're a public stakeholder and you want to engage more with your private stakeholders and you want systems in place, we are there to provide technical assistance to draw that systems or that process for you. Likewise, if you're a private stakeholder with the required mandate under this project and you want that system to be created to have more public-private dialogue, to create more conducive environment for your businesses, we are there to provide that technical assistance. The request, like I said, should come from ACP countries. It should be for ACP countries. For the avoidance of doubt, we have 79 ACP countries, and if you visit the ACP Secretariat, you can check if your country is part of these countries, but we also have a fact sheet that we can provide more information on. So you do check if you are a member of these countries. You also do check if you are a mandated organization that we can work with. And once you do check that, you also do check whether your business environment initiative will improve the business environment indeed, and it is part of the wider strategy because we want to make sure it is sustainable. So once you do check all these things, then you can put in an application, and then we can go through the assessment to provide you that support. So that is it about the business investment climate reform facility. But for this webinar, we are hoping that you get ideas on what you can do to improve the business environment for social enterprises to create more impact investing. So we are very much looking forward to your ideas, to your new initiative and support, and we hope you do enjoy this webinar. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Owen.
Thank you so much, Irene. That's great. So please do take a note of ideas or in any areas that you would potentially like support in. And I do also see in the handout section of the navigation panel, there is the fact sheet there if you wanted to download that and get more information on the facility. Now back to the session today. We are looking at impact investment and taking lessons around impact investment, especially in the kind of COVID context. So just to remind us of the aims and objectives, number one, give actionable examples and insights for policymakers and others that influence the business environment across Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific to identify how they can better leverage the growing strategic case for sustainable investments. Now that's a sentence. And the second one is to stimulate interest amongst participants to get more tailored guidance in the form of a virtual clinic. And I'll go on to talk a little bit more about that much later in the session. Now, to introduce our facilitators for today, we're so pleased to welcome them from the Social Investment Consultancy. You'll be first hearing from Bonnie Chiu. Bonnie is the Managing Director of the Social Investment Consultancy, and she led the firm's international expansion into Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. She has a strong track record in social investment, impact measurement, and diversity and inclusion. Bonnie is a Forbes senior contributor writing on gender and diversity and has been invited to speak in over 18 countries and by corporates about social entrepreneurship and social impact. She has received multiple accolades for her work, named Asia 21 Young Leader by Asia Society, a Forbes 30 under 30 social entrepreneur, and winning the Young Achiever of the Asian Woman of Achievement Awards. She is now based in London in the United Kingdom. And later on, we will be guided through discussion by Sarah Jane Danchie. Sarah is the Associate Director for Africa at the Social Investment Consultancy. She's based in Ghana. She leads the Social Investment Consultancy's multi-country projects in African countries, focusing on socio-economic evaluations, impact measurement, social investment, gender and youth empowerment, advisory and research programs. Sarah has extensive experience of over 23 African countries in multiple sectors, including mining, oil and gas, infrastructure, agriculture, supporting the development of local content and SME development, with an emphasis on promoting environmental, social and governance standards. Sarah was previously with the African Centre for Economic Transformation and the Commonwealth, working on ACP country participation in international trade and investment. So without further ado, because I know you'll want to hear from the real people here, we are going to pass to Bonnie Chiu. Please, Bonnie.
Great. Thanks so much, Owen. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time today to join this very important and timely webinar. I will spend the next 5 minutes or so just running through a bit of context to why we're here today. I don't know how many of you have heard of the term impact investment, sustainable investments, and all these very similar terms, but they all point to this growing interest before COVID, with the intention for investments to generate not only financial returns, but also positive, measurable social and environmental impact. And the kind of investments, whether it's called impact investment, sustainable investment, ESG investments, these asset class has been growing tremendously. So as of 2018, we have close to $500 billion in impact investing assets worldwide, according to a study conducted by the Global Impact Investment Network, GIN in short. And Sub-Saharan Africa makes up 14% of the impact investing assets, and Latin America and the Caribbean making up also another 14%. So there's rising opportunity among ACP countries for impact investing. Among investors that are already active in this field, highest proportion of those investors are actually looking to increase their investment in Sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and we also see European development finance institutions or the likes of IFC also being very active in this space before COVID. So the next slide will show you a bit about also what corporates are doing. So not just financial institutions, but other corporates more broadly are actually going beyond CSR to look at how they can deploy different kinds of instruments, corporate foundations, corporate social impact funds, impact accelerators, social businesses. So we see a proliferation of different actors coming to this space of impact investing and social finance. But the next slide, please. But how has it been so far with COVID-19? What's been really encouraging, despite all the challenges that COVID-19 has posed to our economy, to our healthcare system across the world, it has not stopped the growth of environmental, social, and governance, ESG, in short, investing. So ESG investing is, you can group that also as part of impact investing, but it's investment that are looking at all these factors, ESG factors. And we've seen that actually there's been steady increase in inflows, and that ESG funds have actually performed better than other funds since the start of pandemic. We have some statistics that we've shown here that I won't go into too much detail, but hopefully those are helpful statistics to help you contextualize how ESG and impact investing has done in response to COVID. What's been interesting to highlight is that impact investment has very swiftly responded to COVID-19, and there's a coalition called the Response, Recovery and Resilience, R3 coalition, that was launched in May 2020. We are actually, if you look on their website, it's hosted currently by GIN, the Global Impact Investment Network. They have been sharing some investors brief on how investors should be thinking about COVID-19. But we see increasing interest in SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals aligned themes as a result of COVID, particularly around health and well-being, quality education, and of course, decent work and economic growth. We'll be exploring all these further in our discussions with the panelists. So the next slide, just to end on, thinking about some of the sector areas. We do see a lot of similarities across ACP countries, but there are also particular nuances. So we've just listed kind of some of the sectors we've seen before COVID, what are the target areas for impact investments, and also post-COVID. We definitely see that post-COVID, there's a stronger focus on health and social protection. And also in across African countries, there's quite a strong theme around digital sectors that are enabled by digital and by technologies. And in Pacific countries, as well as Caribbean countries, quite a strong focus on agriculture and climate smart activities. We'll be hearing from our panelists to explore all these further, but we just want to give a bit of context. And now I'll pass it to my colleague, Sarah Jane, to take you through to our first panel to talk about kind of the short-term implications of COVID-19. Sarah Jane, over to you.
Can't currently hear you, Sarah Jane.
I am speaking to you from Accra. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Can you hear me now? Sure. So I'm the Associate Director for Africa at the Social Investment Consultancy. I would like to introduce you today to this panel session, which is the first of two powerful panel panel members. We have with us today Mide Alonge. He's based in Nigeria. He's an innovation expert, entrepreneur, and investor in Sub-Saharan. He's the managing director of Accelerate Africa, a seeded by a company. And he's also the outgoing head of innovation at the private sector health alliance in Nigeria. So we have also from Johannesburg, Zipho, Sikhakhane is Chiu and the founder of EMZ Advisory. This provides advisory and leadership solutions for medium to large corporations. Zipho is an investment committee member for Eastward, and Eastward is an investor group which invests in businesses created by Alonge, Burrows, and social enterprises in Africa. And finally, we have from the Bahamas in the Caribbean, we have Kevin Burrows. He's joining us. He's the founding partner and chief investment officer of a Bahamas-based investment consultancy. He's also the chairman and president of ICR Capital Advisors, a Caribbean-based private equity investment firm. So firstly, with this panel session, we're speaking on the responses to the COVID-19 crisis. We'll be exploring how has the impact investment ecosystem been able to respond to the short-term challenges posed by the pandemic. So by the ecosystem, we are looking at investors, international and local, SMEs, and government and the private sector companies and corporates based in African Caribbean countries. So with that, can we start with you, Mide, in Lagos, Nigeria? Are you there? Can you put your video on, please?
Hi.
Mide,
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Mide, how are you? So please, can you tell us? Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, awesome.
Great. Please, can you tell us a bit about Accelerate Africa, please?
Sure. Thanks again a lot, Sarah Jane. Accelerate Africa is really an advisory firm that supports African small and medium-sized businesses that are really trying to penetrate the African market. I recently was the head of innovation at the Private Sector Health Alliance, which is basically an impact investment fund that was initiated back in 2014/2015 by Mr. Bill Gates, Aliko Dangote, Jimovia, and a few other really big African business leaders. And the concept at the time was that we had been seeing a lot of sort of improvements. When I mean improvements, I mean in terms of growth. So if you look at the telcos, right, especially for African countries, right, the telcos, the finance sectors, they've had huge growth, especially through leveraging technology over the past decade. But when we talk about our healthcare system, we hadn't been seeing the same type of growth. I mean, COVID really exposed a lot of the gaps that we had in the healthcare system. And when you think about the investments that had been coming from the UN, the WHO, and a lot of international development agencies that have been pumping money into the African continent, the idea was that, as of today, we still had a lot of patients dying from very, ailments like malaria, HIV, which in the Western world, we weren't seeing that much progress. So the concept was, how about we invest in innovation in the healthcare space, and maybe we can see the same type of developments that we're seeing with like fintech companies and agri-tech companies and edtech companies. Maybe if we invested in innovation for healthcare, maybe we could see the same type of developments that we've seen in the other sectors. And so that's really how the Private Sector Health Alliance was formed. And it was to simply, for lack of a better word, to invest in healthcare innovations for the Nigerian country as a whole, but eventually for the African continent. And so at Accelerate Africa, what we're really doing there is really just continuing the work that we started at Private Sector Health Alliance. And it's really to try and provide services for small, medium-sized businesses, especially the youths. But even more importantly, we're also trying to play a huge role in promoting future business leaders by engaging a lot more with the universities and the schools, right? We're getting involved with the curriculum. So they were doing a great work with curriculum shift, really trying to ensure that even the education system that we have in Nigeria, but in Africa as a whole, there's a huge element of entrepreneurship, but also innovation, especially because we do know that there's not the job market for youth is really low. I mean, Nigeria, for example, has a really high youth population, but not a lot of jobs to consume and absorb that content. So through innovation, we can solve social problems. primarily before now, what we've been seeing was a lot of copy and paste models where a lot of progresses and inventions that have been happening in the Western world have been tried to be replicated in Nigeria. And the hypothesis was simply trying to understand that that's not going to work. So how do we instill youths and young individuals to develop solutions that can solve their own problems within their local context? Because as we all know, with my other panelists here, the context of the African countries is primarily different from the Western world, and the solutions that will come out of that have to be different, even when you're leveraging technology. Right? You have to look at low-cost technology that can be that can reach a mass population, especially because things like technology penetration is still very is still growing, and so you have to look at innovative ways to access the mass population that is not very expensive. So that's really what we're trying to do a lot of groundwork. So we do a lot of work at the grassroots, at local communities, but even also at universities and schools. And eventually, we want to get to a point where we invest in the startups that come out of our that we support eventually. Sorry, can you hear me?
Sarah Jane, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I think your network is too bad. So is it fine if I take over so we don't?
Yes.
Okay.
Now?
Yeah, I think the network is too bad and I have to jump in. Sorry,
It's
Sarah
pretty
Jane.
bad, Sarah Jane.
Yeah. Yes, I think we will let perhaps Mr. Grant know later about kind of how we need to fix the internet for Ghana. So Mide, we've been hearing you very clearly. Thanks, Mide. It's really helpful to hear your work with young entrepreneurs and kind of in the healthcare space. So if I can then introduce Zipho next to talk about your experience, especially making investments during these times, during COVID-19 in South Africa, and any thoughts you have on this topic. Zipho, can you unmute yourself and share your video as well?
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure, and I'm also glad that this conversation is actually happening today. I'll be talking from the South Africa perspective. I mean, it's been quite an interesting couple of months globally as we're dealing with the pandemic under the current circumstances. But it's been quite interesting, the lessons that can be learned from different perspectives, particularly looking at it from what are some of the opportunities, what does it mean for the ecosystem, and also what's happening in the country overall. So I myself, I'm from EMZ Advisory, so it's an organization I started years ago, and we work a lot with medium to large corporates, right, across the continent, and also multinationals trying to come into the continent. But I'm also involved in quite a couple of boards and looking particularly at how do we actually get impact investing right. One of them being E-Squared Investments, which has been actually quite successful at being able to actually make investments happen in the last couple of months. So what's been happening, I think, just starting with South Africa and then going specifically with the implications in the investment landscape, is that what helped a lot with us is that, there was quite a lot of proactivity. And what I mean by that, not just from the public sector, but also the private sector. So there was just a very, very strong feeling of, look, this is a national issue. This is something that we have to deal with together. And so how do we unite to make sure that the solutions actually work and can be more sustainable? And the focus has been quite strongly at addressing the challenges in the short term as in the country. And what's been interesting also is that I've been very inspired by the humility from all ends, right? So, normally when something happens and we're looking to be part of the solution, there's always call it a competition, private, public, etc. Yet this is one of the first times, very impressively so, where the solution was won. So even the funding sources, I mean, the National Solidarity Fund was set up, and it basically has pooled all the funds in one place, right? So a lot of the impact investment platforms, they've used it to put funds in there, and also outside organizations and also state, and even individuals, right, being encouraged to contribute to that. So what it did immediately is that it got quite a big pool of funds in one space. And then at the same time, it created an opportunity for the investments to actually move quite quickly, because I mean, the people, the decision makers that were sitting behind that were some of the best, investment heads in the country, which has helped a lot from that perspective. And then the lessons from our side, I guess, particularly in terms of what's helped a lot in being able to make investments really work during this time, and actually looking at some of the investments that we've made, particularly with E2, was that we made sure to also look at how do you narrow down your focus, right? So instead of saying, look, we're investing across the board, look at all the opportunities, etc., we basically just cut it into two. It's either opportunities that are response related, so immediately how do I respond, and also the second one is so it's response, and then it's innovation. So the second one is really around innovations. And when we cut them in those two, what we also looked at is we said, within those, what ideas are from a prevention perspective, what ideas are from a detection perspective, what are just general care, and then also which ones are more around support. And what that did is that already it made people funnel themselves and get a little bit more focus in terms of the innovations they were putting on the table, the ideas they were putting on the table. And then also what helped us a lot is putting together a big panel of experts up front, so that already you don't run this challenge of saying, but we don't have an expertise. I mean, as an impact investing organization, I mean, you don't have internally a ton of experts on healthcare. So taking some of the best from a scientific perspective, from some of the advisors, even to the state, and really bringing them, helped us in speeding up the process quite a bit and getting to the results that we needed to see. And then also the other thing that's made a really big difference is that some of the businesses that are already in the portfolio, I mean, they look to pivot quite quickly. One of the advantages in the South African context has been, because there's been so much TB and HIV, right? Some of the expertise, the skills, and even some of the equipment, to some extent, you could actually adapt it quite a bit to what is needed from a COVID-19 perspective. And so to some extent that wave, was made advantage of quite a bit, because then what it meant is that the organizations that are ready to pivot, you could actually put a lot of confidence in them to say, look, if I back these guys, it will really, really make a big difference. And then the last one I wanted to then flag also is this one around, I guess, that one of the things that's important about coming from an impact investment perspective is really patience, right? And being patient in the capital approach. And that's paid off significantly around these times, because I know that, if you look at general investments, I mean, people they think of pulling out or all kinds of reasons of not being involved or looking at sell-off. And I think this is when you really show your true objectives and your authenticity as an impact investor, because this is the time to really back the businesses so that they can actually sustain themselves now and also beyond the pandemic. So I think for me, those are the things that were top of mind to highlight. I think there's definitely a theme of collaboration across the board, which to some extent just enabled some proactivity. And what we did from the small businesses also, and what we did from our perspective, is also trying to figure out how do you therefore customize so that you can make the process move a little bit faster and get to more solutions quicker.
Thanks so much, Zipho. Sorry you lost me there. I hope you can hear me now. Great.
Yes.
Great, thanks so much. So can we move over to Kevin? Kevin from the Bahamas. Hi, Kevin. Oh.
Hi, Sikhakhane. Good morning, good evening.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Could you tell us what types of challenges the crisis has posed to countries in the Caribbean?
Sure. So, for a region that's pretty much accustomed to having storms, COVID-19 certainly has come along as one of the perfect ones to hit our region. I think first and foremost, as you and your listeners know, the islands are very dependent on tourism and hospitality, industries, which have been completely disrupted. In a number of cases, including the Bahamas, our borders are still closed. We did open them and had to actually close it again at the beginning of this week because we had a second surge, a spike in cases that really were not directly tied to tourists coming into the country, but really part of it was also Bahamians flying out into hotspots and bringing it back. So for tourism-dependent countries, this is certainly a huge blow. The government's revenue in the Bahamas is down sort of 80% on year-on-year comparatives. A second challenge that, maybe not so much in the Bahamas because we're kind of sparsely populated in an archipelago, but in other parts of the Caribbean, you have close to 1 million people living in informal settlements where it's pretty difficult to either go in and enforce social distancing or be able to put the protocols in place. And also, if you have a large informal economy, then it's very difficult for them to access some of the government programs that have been put in place to try and alleviate this big blow to consumption that we've seen. So if you don't have a national insurance number, you don't have a bank account, you're not on the government's radar, it's very difficult for us to be able to put some sort of support in your hands. And finally, talking about storms, we're still in a region that 6 months of the year is the hurricane season. The Bahamas in particular was hit very hard last year by Hurricane Dorian, which is one of the strongest storms on record. So we are still cleaning up with that, and that is an area that continues to stress and hang over the head of the Caribbean. So yeah, I mean, there are a number of challenges that we usually deal with, and the crisis is just adding to it.
Right. Could you can you hear me now? Could you tell
Yes.
us a bit about your role with the government in the Economic Recovery Committee and also the Fiscal Responsible Council? What was some of the government involvement?
Yeah, exactly. So a year ago, the government had put in place what we call the FRC, the Fiscal Responsibility Council, and where we've, by legislation, mandated fiscal reform, fiscal targets. We are targeting a debt to GDP ratio of below 50%, down from, say, 57% in 2017 when they were first contemplating the bill. So clearly we've had to backtrack on those targets post-COVID. We're expecting debt to GDP in the Bahamas to increase to at least 85% and kind of stay there for a while, for a number of years. In the rest of the Caribbean, there are other equivalent fiscal responsibility councils that are being set up. There's one in Jamaica that's about to become operational. Same with Barbados. Grenada is up and running as well. So again, we will work closely with the government just to opine on their budgets and how to navigate the spending that will necessarily have to take place in this post-COVID environment. One of the things that the government has done sort of post-COVID is really look at how can we diversify the Bahamian economy, and of course we've seen it in the rest of the Caribbean as well. So part of that action has been the establishment of an economic recovery committee whose mandate is really to see where we can diversify our economies away from just tourism or away from financial services, which again is a very large part of what we do and what they do in the Caymans and the Bermudas of the world. So again, it's the government has reacted well. We've reacted quickly, through what we call the Small Business Development Center. The government has put additional funding in the hands of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. So they acted in March to put this program in place. So they funded it with an additional 20 million on top of an existing 20 million allocation. And they've recently added another 5 million in just pure grants for the companies that qualify for the loans. So again, but we really have to emphasize that we are still in the middle of this crisis, and our response is evolving as it seems like the crisis, the length of time of this crisis will draw out. So we'll certainly see more things come through the pike. Sure.
And could you lastly just end with what the Caribbean is doing in terms of environmental, social, and governance and SDG investing?
Yeah, I mean, the whole topic of sort of ESG and SDG investing is fairly new in the Caribbean. The firm that I work with, the Lattice Capital Advisors, we've been working sort of pre-COVID with partners up in New York called 17 Asset Management, and named for the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So we were already in the process of creating a fund and a research report for the Caribbean, specifically on ESG and socially responsible investing. So, and it's interesting that we've kind of had the first session, and our first report came out in January, again, prior to COVID. And from back there, we kind of highlighted the needs, the SDG needs of the Caribbean along the lines of sustainable agriculture and food security, healthcare infrastructure, access to reliable energy, climate adaptation, of course, and affordable and sustainable housing. And I think, COVID hasn't really changed the focus of what we've seen. We've highlighted these areas that certainly are again, very important in the post-COVID environment. So we look forward to see what the governments will do to assist in bringing investment into those various areas.
Great. We can turn now for some questions. Owen, can you help me?
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. And sorry, Sarah Jane, your connection kind of comes in and out a little bit, but thank you for persisting with that. And thank you to all three of those panelists. That's really interesting to hear. Zipho, I was interested in returning to you just to hear a little bit more about the kind of patient capital, which you mentioned a little bit, and how that's really kind of coming into its own at the moment. Is that something that you felt has been particularly prevalent in South Africa, or does there need to be more patient capital, I guess, in terms of COVID situation, but longer term as well? Hopefully Zippo's still here and can hear me. She might not be.
Yes, I'm here. And, the perspective that I was coming from is, I think, during this time, I think with all the pressure that we're seeing, and we're seeing this across the board, so, people are feeling a lot of, call it anxiety, and they're trying to stay away from making decisions a little bit that go beyond, that go beyond the next week, if not the next month, etc. And for me, the direction that I was going is that at the fundamental, when you're thinking about building businesses of impact and businesses that are more sustainable, at the heart of that's when they need our patience the most. That's when they really need our patience the most. And what worries me now is, when you hear language of, but even if I do invest, how soon can this turn around, right? And I think for me, the spirit is, it's encouraging more and more to remember the fundamentals, right? Which is impacts, and also in general, sustainability. At the heart of it is understanding that it is going to take some time to lead to some results. And to some extent, we also need to consider, actually revising even the investment amounts that we commit to. Because what ends up happening is that because everyone is planning under uncertainty, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's enough. And also some of the innovations can really, really scale quite quickly. And they can't do that if they're not backed up by the right liquidity. So that is something that for me has been very, very top of mind, to say, let's go back to the fundamentals as to why we are in this space to begin with.
So I guess there it's kind of highlighting the need for investment to be both agile to some extent and to really be responsive to what this uncertain era presents, but also to kind of have that commitment and to really have that partnership and that patience built in and embedded in the arrangements that people have with investees. Okay, that's great. I would just remind attendees that there is the opportunity to ask questions at this stage. We'll be going to a short break soonish. but please do use the chat function or the questions function, which should be in your navigation pane, to ask any of our panel members any questions or anybody else that you've heard from so far. But thank you for the moment, Zipho. I will just return also to Mide. Mide, if you're still there and able to turn your camera back on. We'd be interested in hearing a little bit about any advice that you might have. Hello. Any advice that you might have for entrepreneurs and SMEs during this time, whether that's from your own experience or from your work with investors or policymakers?
Yeah, so I will speak from an investor perspective, right? So for us, I mean, COVID was a really, really major part, simply because, I mean, as healthcare investors, right, COVID was a major, it made a major shift in how people were responding to healthcare innovations, right? If you think about healthcare innovations over the past decade or two in Africa for general, necessarily they weren't getting the best investments. So even when global investors or even accelerators would run programs, I mean, when you see the shortlist and you dissect the analysis of the startups that got the investments, healthcare would necessarily be at the bottom. And it made sense. It made sense simply because of the metrics that were used to analyze investment cases, right? Whether it's return on investments, how quickly you can make your money back, things like that. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to try to do a lot of capacity building and for even investors, for other investors that were not healthcare focused, simply because we learned that when you're thinking about healthcare startups, for example, healthcare businesses, you have to learn that you may not get your money as fast as a fintech company, but the impact is a lot bigger, right? And that's why for us as impact investors, we chose to play a role to educate other investors, but to also try to incentivize more entrepreneurs. Because if you look at a very smart young African in school, that's really good at tech and start up a business, right? It's going to look at where's the money going. Ideally, they're probably going to go into probably fintech simply because it's buzzing, everyone's talking about it. But what we wanted to do was to do a paradigm shift for that, so that we could aspire more young individuals to come together to start up healthcare businesses, simply because that's what, at the end of the day, that's where lives are saved. I mean, for us, when you think about healthcare innovations, whether it's, I mean, in Africa, for example, whether it's malaria, HIV, or any of those other ailments, you think about that's where lives are saved. And regardless of how much money you make, I mean, at the end of the day, you want to be alive, right? So as much as you don't see a lot of innovation or investment in that space, we saw that there was a big need for that. And so that's really why the fund was started. So, but from an advisor's perspective, now coming to COVID is a totally different ballgame. Simply because COVID exposed a lot of pros and cons for healthcare innovations, but also investment. And I think I will start with the investments. So in Nigeria, for example, there was the coalition against COVID that was set up by private sector companies called COVID. As of today, about almost 30 billion naira was raised, which is somewhere roughly about $100 million, right? Over $100 million, or about $100 million was raised from private sector companies to invest in healthcare interventions against COVID for Nigerians. And a big chunk of that was to go for healthcare startups, healthcare interventions that were tackling COVID cases. And this ranged from those that were in the data analysis, disease reporting, even the isolation centers building, depending on what sort of technology they were using. Now, as healthcare investors from our end, now our company as Private Sector Health Alliance was set up by private sector individuals as well. So there was a big push for us to ensure that a lot of startups and healthcare investors were getting the funding. However, I mean, COVID was a new sort of, ailment, disease, whatever the case is. So there wasn't sort of any existing businesses that were tackling such. Now, what we saw from an investor perspective was the businesses that were able to shift and adapt, especially those that were leveraging technology, made a quicker shift in shifting towards tapping into funds that were geared towards those that were tackling COVID. So let's say you were a health tech company that already did disease surveillance, right? But obviously COVID wasn't part of it, but you were able to shift COVID into that, and you were able to help the federal government to track visitors that were coming in from the from the airports very quickly and monitor their healthcare records up until if they ever got COVID. If you're able to sort of adapt to such, then you were able to get funds from us. I mean, $100 million is quite a chunk of money for a startup, right? That didn't sort of think about accessing those funds. And so what we saw from an investor side, because I mean, our investments were geared towards milestones. Once COVID hit, 90% of businesses or startups could not achieve their milestones anymore, which made sense, right? Because the rest of the world was also going through the same. However, some companies were able to sort of start adapting to it. But to today, close to 50% are still not able to do so because one, their business culture was not able to adapt to the new sort of scenario post-COVID. And what that means is, how much technology was infused in your business structures, how much sort of innovative are the individuals in the company to use, let's say, to embrace virtual communication or virtual deals, right? In Africa and Nigeria.
Yeah, we've got one other question. So if you're just able to wrap up briefly, and then I can pass on to Zipho. But yeah, no, this is good.
Okay. Yeah, no. So basically, the summary is what we learned from an investor perspective is a lot of African startups were not able to sort of quickly shift. But so a lot of the work we've been doing now is to try and help them transition towards embracing the new world post-COVID so that they can actually tap into the funds. Because from a healthcare perspective, what COVID has done, it's brought a lot more funds for innovations and businesses that are tackling healthcare problems. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I met some of those in Lagos last year, actually, and there was lots going on there. It'd be interesting to return to them now. So we do just have one question before we will just go to a short break from Katlego Raputi, and I'm sure I've pronounced your name incorrectly, so I do apologize. But it's to Zipho. Do you think the Solidarity Fund is achieving its objectives? If not, what are some of the reasons, bottlenecks, and constraints?
Yeah, clearly an intelligent person behind that question. I like those because it means she might have some ideas, so she must send them through to the crew. So one, I think for me, it's phenomenal progress, just mainly because being able to pull so much funding, I mean, billions of rands in such a short space of time. And just recently, right, at the beginning of July, I mean, they approved another half a billion rands towards getting critical healthcare equipment. So the speed at which they're moving for me is quite impressive. And even if you think about the amount of time they had to set up, it was very short. It was very, very short. So to be able to, within a space of 3 weeks, set up a whole infrastructure. I mean, I remember talking to some of the people who were heading it as they were setting it up. It was quite a lot of pressure, but the commitment for me was really impressive from their perspective. I think what also has moved me a lot is that even in the investments that have been made, by the way, they have made investments already, which is also another thing that's impressive, is they're not just focusing on just healthcare, right? In terms of the initiatives, I mean, it was impressive that they even put money behind, supporting victims of gender-based violence. I mean, millions was put behind this just because the gender-based violence actually went up because people were stuck at home, unfortunately, with the impacts of the lockdown. And so for me, I think to some extent, they've made progress. Could they have made more? Of course. But I just think given the volume of stakeholders involved and the amount of work that's needed to pull off something like that, it's better than no results at all. The challenges are still significant, right? And I think the challenges is a lot of what small businesses still struggle with in South Africa, because when funding opportunities are available, right, it doesn't mean that therefore the right people actually can get access because of the challenge of paperwork. A lot of the funds available, they want you to have been maybe established for at least a year as a company for you to even qualify. So you find that a lot of the people who are interested with some of the ideas and some of the innovations, they might not be investment ready, and there isn't enough time to get them to be ready also, given everything that's going on. And so that's the challenge. And to go into the solution space, for me, what I encourage is, particularly all the bodies that are making funding available is also at the same time actually making the support available so that the individuals can be investment ready, but also they get enough support so their businesses can actually be sustainable as we go along. So I hope that answers the question from that perspective. But I think a lot more could have been done, I agree, but at the same time, I think I'm just impressed by the fact that we've actually been able to just execute something to begin with. You know, normally when there's partnerships, particularly private, public, there's usually more discussions, there's usually more politics involved, and there's also a lot of talk and no action. And to some extent, being able to see the results of some of the investments being made and also additional funding being raised, it's a sign of hope in the right direction, because this journey ahead is going to be long before it ends.
That's great. Thank you, Zipho. That's such a good answer. And I think it also does highlight the kind of role for these sorts of things where we're kind of sharing learning from those sorts of initiatives, and people are coming from all sorts of corners of the world with different experiences of what's worked and what hasn't, all around a kind of common pandemic and crisis that we're all facing, but which plays out differently in lots of areas and for different groups as well. And I think that came across also through all of your talks. So thank you to our first three panelists, specifically Mide, Zipho and Kevin. That was really great and really stimulating. We are now going to have a kind of 5-minute interim period, so people please do and go and refill your drinks if you would like to, and we will then be going on to hear from Bonnie and from the second group of panel members in the second half of the session. So we'll probably return at 4:05. I will just say, following on from this webinar, there is the opportunity to seek support through a virtual one-on-one clinic with some of the people and experts that you've heard from today. This is a targeted support opportunity for organizations from African, Caribbean and Pacific countries that have some kind of mandate or potential to influence and affect the business environment or the investment climate in those regions. So please do get in touch if there's a particular area that your organization would like support with, and we can see whether you're eligible for that and try and fit you into a virtual one-on-one clinic. There's details about how to access that support on your screen at the moment, but in short, it's please register your interest by the 30th of July 2020 by sending an email to ICR Facility at giz.de, and please in that email indicate your organization and the questions that you have. Please also note that this is available in both English and French if that's of use to you as well, so please don't be put off by a language barrier on that basis. Is there anything else for me to say at the moment? No, so I think if we return at 5 past the hour, I was going to say 4:05, but that's just for me, and I know we've got people from different time zones here. We'll return at 5 past the hour to hear from the second session and the second panel. And please do continue to pose any questions in the question box or the chat box as they arise, and we will try and put those to the panel members. So thank you for staying with us, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back everybody if you went away, and welcome also if you are just joining. We are now going to start with the second session of today's webinar. And we again have got a great panel lined up for you, but I am for the moment going to pass over to Bonnie Chiu, who is Managing Director of the Social Investment Consultancy. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thanks, Owen. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. And thanks so much for our previous panel for a very, very interesting discussion with so many concrete examples of how investors as well as investees are navigating COVID-19. Now, some of the themes I hear from the previous panel, such as collaboration between different actors, particularly public-private partnerships, innovation being another theme, and the role of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, will be ones that we continue to unpack during our panel. This panel discussion is more focused on the long-term recovery and the long-term impact of COVID-19 and how this can move us towards a more inclusive economy. Turning to the next slide, we have the bios of the three very distinguished speakers. I will read their names and then invite them individually to speak. So how I'm going to structure the panel discussion is similarly, we'll hear individually from each panelist, each making 5 to 7 minutes remarks based on their experiences. And then we'll have a bit of discussion among the panelists before then turning into Q&A. So please, again, put in any questions you have in the question box or in the chat box. So we have Christelle Kupa. She's calling in from London, the UK. Her camera unfortunately is not working, but this image of her, hopefully you can visualize Christelle talking to us from the UK. She's the CEO of Uhusaino Capital and with a Pan-African remit, and she has a lot of experience in gender lens investing as well. Next we have Mr. Yofi Grant. He's the CEO of the Ghana Investment Promotion Center, responsible for encouraging and promoting investments in Ghana. So very excited to hear not only from investors but also from policymakers working on the investment ecosystem. So thank you, Mr. Grant, for joining us as well. And finally, we have Dr. Frank Aswani from South Africa. He's the CEO of the African Venture Philanthropy Alliance, which is working to increase capital flows into social investments in Africa. So again, very happy to hear from an ecosystem player that has the view of the whole continent and how new players are looking into social investment. But first, I will turn to Christelle. Christelle, I know you can't show your camera, unfortunately, but would you be able to tell us just a little bit about what you're currently doing, how COVID-19 has affected some of the work, and where do you see the opportunities moving forward?
Sure. I hope you can hear me.
It's very well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very pleased that I'm able to participate to this conversation. So I just going to give you a couple of rundown on Uhusaino Capital. So I am a founder and CEO of Uhusaino Capital. We are an impact investment advisory firm based in London, but deserving and working with Pan-Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. So what we do, we call ourselves the link between I would say European investment and project and fund on the ground. So we really bringing our investors. We've got a very strong investor base here in the UK, but in Europe, I would say most importantly. They range from family offices to high net worth individuals, but as well as really impact investors as well. And we are always looking for good opportunity that are financially rewarding, but most importantly also having a social or environmental impact, or both as well. So we're taking a view of making investment with an impact investment lens, and so that's really what we do in terms of the capital raising. And then we're also doing advisory in terms of making sure that companies they just come to us, and we can also advise them on how to write narrative, or helping them to have a structure in terms around the impact and ESG. Then I would say on, and I just mentioned that because it's actually part of the conversation, but on my second hat also, I am a strategic advisor to the First Lady of the DRC Foundation. I am originally from the DRC, my heritage, and I've been tasked for the past few months now to really come as a support and a strategic advisor for the work that her team and herself are doing in the DRC. The reason why it's actually quite handy also in this conversation, because you know, we'd like to also talk and mention how, you know, I would say it's public and private sector can also work really well together, and I think one can you know, push the other into the right direction. So what we do over there is really to you know, kind of move or help the philanthropic effort that have been done on from NGOs mainly, and her foundation is one of them. And you know, we can also help to transform that, or help to build also around the work that they do a more sustainable way to come to the community. So really that's what we do on the DRC. But then on the Pan-African side, we do Uhusaino Capital. We are bringing streaming capital into projects such as agriculture. We take a really strong view on agriculture. It's you know, one of the SDG that needs to have the full attention, especially in this climate as well. We've seen that food security and agriculture are very key also to be able to tackle. The other element, or the other point I wanted to also mention, is really the gender, because we are very strong in gender lens, not exclusive. We're not just feminist. We really just like to promote also and helping women that are very strong on the continent mainly, and to really ensure that we are able to also bring capital to them, and ensuring that also women-led are not forgotten, also bringing capital to them, and also expertise and leadership as well, in terms of the field in which they are. During, of course, this COVID, you know, we're all living the COVID in different ways, but I would say that mainly capital has been potentially a little bit more scarce. It's not so easy to still bring the capital, but I want to say that over the past few months, I've been, you know, in a strong contact with investors, and they're still very keen to participate into the development also, and working alongside a very good project in Africa. So we have quite a few family offices. We've got also quite a few just individuals that are interested to come in within the framework of even COVID. Also, there are also a lot of COVID relief funding, you know, that are popping up. I won't say every day, but quite on a regular basis. And there's actually one, especially here with the EU. We are, you know, obviously under the EU as well. So they've also put a very strong effort to put a kind of COVID relief also backed for the continent. I think the numbers are actually quite high. They've just shifted some of the fund program that were supposed to go for the European Fund for Sustainable Development, and they've shifted you know, quite a lot actually for Africa. I would say probably around 2 billion for Sub-Saharan Africa has been shifted to the COVID relief funding. So you know, there are still you know, I'm kind of the voice of you know, saying that there are still quite a lot of funding available. Just need to find, obviously need to see exactly what type of project you have to be able to reach out to that. I think I will probably leave it now until
Thanks
we can...
so much, Christelle. Yeah. Great, thanks so much. That's really helpful as an overview, and to kind of see both the challenges and opportunities. And I want us to pick on the theme of blended finance, how philanthropy and impact investment can work hand in hand together. So we'll pick that up later. And I think given Christelle's work with the First Lady of the DRC, is a good transition to hear from our policy maker representative, Mr. Grant, from Ghana Investment Promotion Center. I think unfortunately Mr. Grant's camera is also not working. We have maybe a plague on our panel, but Mr. Grant, are you able to talk? Hi, Mr. Grant. Are you with us, Mr. Grant? Okay. Well, while we try to fix that, shall we turn to Dr. Frank first? We might need to try to fix the technical issue here. But yeah, Dr. Frank is joining us from the African Venture Philanthropy Alliance. I thought, Frank, it would be really great just to hear a bit more about your work and how you see COVID kind of shifting the landscape and where the opportunities really lie.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'm glad my camera is working so I can represent the panel visually at least. So my name is Frank Aswani. I'm the CEO of African Venture Philanthropy Alliance. We're a Pan-African network of social investors who will collaborate to increase the flow of capital in social investments in Africa. I think on the whole concept of the crisis of COVID, it's we're always told two main things I've heard that are really stuck with me. One, we've got a gift of a crisis. In essence, we have a crisis that we should use to our advantage to really change some fundamental flaws and things that will sustainably move us forward. And tied to that is really the whole idea of don't waste this crisis. Let's use this crisis to our advantage to really drive some fundamental changes in the way we have approached social investments in Africa in the past. So if I look at the challenge of social investment and from the framework of SDGs, Africa needs about $500 billion to $1.2 trillion annually between now and 2030 to meet its SDG financing gap. Now, that money generally would normally have come from tax collections of governments or government revenues, and a portion of it from aid, and some of it would come from FDIs. But the reality is that model of depending on those sources of revenues is currently under huge challenge. As more African countries move into the middle income status, aid to Africa is reducing. In fact, we're seeing a reduction in per capita aid to Africa, and that is made or exacerbated by the fact that our population is growing. I think we'll see donor countries being under a lot more pressure now to justify why they're sending more money out of their countries, especially after COVID has exposed the challenged healthcare systems that some of them have. And our governments are also under huge pressure from public debt. We've borrowed a lot to build infrastructure in Africa over the last couple of years, but the COVID crisis, I think, has added insult to injury. The last, for example, I had in South Africa is the public debt in South Africa is up to about 80% of GDP at the moment. So the traditional sources of money to go into social investments are going to be put under huge pressure. So enough of us, we need to be talking about the problem, because Einstein said, if you've got an hour to solve a problem, spend 55 minutes really talking about it and understanding the problem. Because it creates a sense of urgency around it. So I think that's the first thing we need to be looking at. The second thing is we need to be thinking about, okay, so if we don't have that money in the social investment space, where are we going to get the money from? And that money would most likely come from the private sector. But as you and I know, private sector investors don't find social investments attractive enough. So we need to be thinking, how do we de-risk social investments to make them attractive to the private sector? And for that to happen, this is really the time for us, as I said, we've got the gift of a crisis to really embrace innovative finance as a way of looking at how we fund and finance social investments moving forward. So we're talking about moving away from funding to investing, in essence, going forward. But one of the things that then has to change is, how do we build innovative financing capacity on the continent? And how do we kind of make this a lot more mainstream among social investors on the continent? And when I talk about social investors, I'm talking about the range of investors who are investing for social return on their investment with varying expectations of financial return. So you've got on your far left, you can imagine on your far left philanthropists who have no expectation of financial returns, to the far right of private capital that has market-related financial returns. But the common thread amongst them is they're all looking for social returns. And when you look at innovative financing, as a network, that's a key focus for us, is how do we generally improve the capabilities of innovative financing competencies among social investors in Africa, so that we can embrace a lot more of approaches and practices around impact investing, blended finance, and that kind of stuff. And I'd love someone to correct me if I'm wrong, but we found that there's only one university in Africa that has any sort of form of a semblance of an innovative finance program, and that's UCT in Cape Town. And that really surprised me when I dug a bit deeper into this. So we've, as AVPA, we are really focused on one of the things we want to do is how do we build capacity amongst our knowledge institutions of knowledge and learning in Africa, so they can be the centers of excellence much closer to our social investors in rolling out innovative finance. So that's a gap that we're going to be trying to look to address through training programs and that kind of stuff to do that, to enhance the practice of an adoption of innovative finance. The other thing we also recognize, Bonnie, is that for us to crowd in private sector capital, we need to also build adequate pools of catalytic capital. And this will only happen if we get our current grant makers to diversify their investment strategy away from just doing pure grants, as many of them do today, to also playing in the catalytic capital space. Now that also takes its own path of transition, and it's not just pulling along the management teams of these foundations, DFIs, governments as well, but also their boards and other decision makers, and that's something we also have to invest in quite actively. So there's all this kind of stuff that's happening at the moment that we need to move, but especially in the recovery and resilience phase of the COVID crisis, there's a really strong place and space for innovative finance and impact investing to take root. And we, as a community of social investors, not just those deploying financial capital, but also those deploying human and intellectual capital, this is a time for us to stand up and be counted. We really need to be doing a lot more in this space at the moment.
Great, thanks so much, Frank. That was really, yeah, there's so much there to unpack. I think kind of the external pressure that have been created by COVID, as well as what's happening in country, and kind of those public debt that countries have accumulated, and the role of private sector, that's yeah, a lot for us to dig deeper into. And I do think your last point around this community of social investors is not just financial capital, and that echoes what Zipho was talking about in the earlier panel, that as much as capital is needed, is also the support that's needed to help some of these enterprises actually get to that point where they can absorb the investments and grow. Will you be able to tell us a bit more also about a few of the SDGs initiatives that you're doing, the two platforms where you're bringing investors together? I think that will be really interesting. You're still on mute, Frank. Okay, I've unmuted you. Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, apologies. Yeah, but yeah, there's a quote I like to quote by an author called management author called Margaret Whitley, and she said, the world doesn't change one person at a time. It changes as networks of relationships form amongst people who discover that they share a common cause and a vision of what's possible. And that is really
Where's the quote
true.
from?
It's from a management consultant. Her name is Margaret Whitley.
Okay.
And it really talks about the power of collectives, of the collective. And we recognize that to enable people to invest smarter, solve problems quicker, and learn a lot more effectively and more efficiently, we need to create communities of practice. So one of the things we're looking to do on the AVPA platform, we're doing some interesting stuff. So we've just finished doing a social investment landscape study that looked at the social investment space. We did a mapping exercise across 9 countries in Africa, 3 in East, South, and West Africa. And the study is actually, we've just got the first draft a week and a half ago. We're kind of in the edit process. It should be ready in the next 2-3 weeks. But that will kind of give us a baseline of the social investment scape. And we'll repeat this study every 3 years to see how practice is changing, how capital is moving, you know, those kind of things over time. But in that context, we've realized that, and working with our sister networks in Asia and Europe, that communities of practice are really important around specific thematic issues. So if you bring people together around a very specific problem to solve, you get better collaboration, better coordination, more efficient movement of capital. And we're looking to do a series of platforms that are related to key topics in Africa. And we're starting off with a gender platform. Under the gender platform, we'll have a couple of different communities, one of them being a gender-lens investing community. So anyone who's social investors keen in gender-lens investing will coalesce and aggregate under that community. We'll do a health community, a gender-based violence community, and an economic and livelihood community. So underneath that gender platform will be those 4 communities to start off with. And what we believe and what I've seen in other places where similar things have been done, like in our Asian network, is it much more accelerates collaboration across partners. It brings them together much quicker. It also accelerates the ability for them to co-invest in each other's opportunities. And to support them through that, we're also going to be, this platform is 4 or 5 weeks away to be set up, and another platform that's 4 or 5 weeks to be set up on our website will be our deal share platform, because the whole idea is to make sure that they can collectively co-invest much faster, because ultimately we want a lot more money to come into African social investment and opportunities. And then the second platform we'll be looking at is an SME support platform, which we'll be looking to set up in another couple of weeks. But we're really excited about the prospect of doing that, and this has proven quite successful in other places. So stay in touch. We'd love to bring as many people playing in those spaces as possible onto a common African platform. And what AVPA will do is not only expose those opportunities to a greater, wider network of international investors, but also connect people solving similar platforms in Africa to people solving similar platforms in Asia, and in the process create kind of international coalitions around common problems like gender-based issues or SME support. That's the kind of stuff we want to do.
Thanks so much, Frank. And I think we have Mr. Grant with us now. Hi, Mr. Grant. Oh, we still can't hear you. I think, can you unmute? Let me unmute you. Hi, Mr. Grant.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yes.
Sorry, I had to switch from my MacBook to my iPad. It seems to be doing
no problem. I think my colleague Sarah Jane, who's from Ghana as well, had problems. So I don't know if it's an issue for the whole country.
I don't know. Maybe it's the MacBooks because the iPad is working well. But I'm indeed very pleased to be with you this afternoon. Sorry about that hiccup. And then I think that for me, there are a few issues that we must recognize, and especially when it comes to impact investment. And I did say a week ago in another forum that the African problem, especially in the wake of COVID, is a global problem. It's not just one to the continent, because the problems that we have cannot be solved if Africa alone solves those problems, and it will be a problem that will be solved if the whole world comes together to solve it. That's one. Secondly, I always suspect that there needs to be a certain conceptual differentiation between the meanings of SDGs to the African continent and the meaning of SDGs to developed markets. And for Africa, I clearly see that SDGs are really the key focus of our financial development projects and our budgets. And so even outside the frame of government, we realize that there are certain basic things that the continent is accelerating growth on that will transform the continent. For example, education, health, sanitation, housing, and all these things, which may be taken for granted. But in the continent of Africa, there are real key development issues. So most of our development outcomes and objectives are naturally geared to achieving the SDGs. But then having said that, what has been the template in the past and where are we going with it? I think in the past, there's been a lot of focus on centralism of development on the African continent. And of course, we can understand that coming from a continent that was largely colonized. But over the past past 10 years or so, with more constitutional governance and democracy, we've seen that most governments are now embracing partnerships with the private sector, foreign direct investment, as well as relationships with multinationals and DFIs as part of the financing mix to achieve their development objectives. And in Ghana, we have over this period really seen that at work, where we've worked first with the private sector in alleviating some of the problems of COVID, but also fashioning out the development agenda going forward. And an interministerial committee, which has coordinated and collated views and assistance from the private sector. And one of the very good examples where this has actually happened is where the private sector mobilized funding to actually build hospitals. The first one is being completed under 3 months. It's the state-of-the-art center for disease. And it was a partnership between the private sector and the government. Additionally, as I speak right now, we're actually reading our mid-year budget review. And so my ears are in two places. But as it is, we also formulated what we call the CARES program, which is the Corona Alleviation and Recovery to Enterprises Support Program, in which government has formed a strategic partnership to look at the COVID period, but also post-COVID recovery and rejuvenation of the economy from the year 2021 to 2023. And we have actually formulated an envelope of about 100 billion cedis, which will be somewhere in the region of 20 to 30 billion dollars, to re-establish the economy. Mind you, Ghana pre-COVID was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. But COVID has shown that it shows no mercy to anybody. So we also have a fair bit. We've had to revise our GDP growth from 6.8% to 0.9%. It's still growth, but far from what we projected. Now, I listened to Frank, and I think Frank really spelled it out pretty well. The fact that the world today cannot be about individualism anymore. It must be about communalism. Now, communalism is nothing to do with communists, but saying that we need to work together to first put the world back into recovery, and then and re-establish some of the many economic activities that were lost. For example, trade disruption, value chain disruptions, supply chain disruptions, financing disruptions, and we've seen it at the GIPC, where we had very aggressive programs actually in place, but sadly fizzled out by March, either put on the back burner till things improve or go forward. But what government has done is to now recognize that we need to, even more so than before, create an opportunity of partnerships. And that partnerships would include the private sector, non-government actors, including some of the actors that we've been working with. And we've been working very closely with WEF, UNCTAD, and WTO to fashion out modalities on which we can actually create those partnerships, those sustainable partnerships. Now, those partnerships are very critical for sustainability. And I tell you why I keep focusing on the idea of the African opportunity. As we speak, and I keep saying that Africa is still a resource-rich country. And as we recover from COVID, it is only natural that there might be some increased interest on the continent. Africa also has about 60% of the world's remaining arable land left, which could possibly feed the world post-COVID. And so that also presents a unique opportunity for global partnerships. And I think that this is a time more so than ever where it's become an issue of not just regionalization, but also re-globalization on making sure that there's sustainability in life. I kept saying, and last week we had a conference where I mentioned that if only one region finds a cure for this virus and sticks to that cure and doesn't allow it to be global, they won't solve a problem, because no country is an island. And I relate to the quotation that Frank gave out, that more so than ever, we are in a time when sustainability depends on all of us, not just one party. And so I believe that the African continent is now repositioning itself for better global interaction. And at Ghana, we are spearheading this by making sure that even in our investment code, we allocate incentives to who we'll call the responsible investor, those that enable us achieve the SDGs quicker and are more active and dynamic in social and impact investing, as well as those that enable partnerships with the local economy to ensure that we spread whatever opportunities there are, that they are not only focused on foreign direct investments, but the partnership of the foreign direct investor and the indigenous investor. I think I'll start with that, and then we can further discuss others when we go on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Grant. I'm so pleased that the technology worked in our favor in the end, because to hear your perspectives has been just so helpful. And I think British Council and the ICR facility, surely a lot of what you said is chimes with what their mission is as well. I want to turn to a few questions and that have been surfaced in the chat. And if I can just remind everyone to keep your answers short. But I have a question first coming from Kibret from Ethiopia. So they are running a private ambulance service in Ethiopia, and they are interested in understanding how they can influence the government to work more in private-public partnerships, especially as a private company that they're working in that provide advanced life support ambulance for critically ill COVID patients, but it seems that they've had trouble working with the government in getting the government pay for their service without making a bid for all the providers. So any thoughts, Mr. Grant, to put you on the spot? Of course, a different government, but
right, yes, I mean, I feel very strongly about that governments alone cannot do this. It must be a partnership between the government and the private sector. After all, I mean, government as a proportion of the population of the country is always a minute sector, and therefore decisions taken have a constituency which they apply. And therefore, for governments to try and do it alone would be catastrophic. It definitely has to do it in partnership with the private sector. And in West Africa, we actually have a platform called the WAPSCON, the West African Private Sector Corona Network, which is a network of private business people and acting in partnership with government. To make sure that they bring relief to testing, they bring support to testing, and also to bring support to treatment. And it's in that vein, and I did mention that the private sector, there's a private sector group in the Ghana circumstance, which has actually constructed a 100-bed hospital, full-kitted state-of-the-art hospital, and they're going to construct 3 or 4 more to alleviate government's program, because we recognize that the government on its own will not be able to provide all the resources. Additionally, we've worked with some private sector actors, especially in technology, who have opened access to testing. One such company, M-Pharma, is a Ghanaian tech company, but not just in Ghana. It's operating almost all through the continent. And I believe that the private sector in this country needs to make a strong pitch to government with the offer. First, understand the ask from government, and then offer what they can. I'm not sure that government would at any time say, no, we will not take your assistance, or we will not understand it. But behind all that is also to incentivize the private sector to be able to contribute strategically, but significantly. And that is what we are doing here in Ghana, where it's an open partnership, and we believe that the private sector may even be more active on the ground than government is, because government usually is procedure and process, private sector is execution. And so for us, it's very important to have that partnership, and more so at this time than ever, where private sector will play a role in supporting government deal with the COVID issues. I mean, right now, government in Ghana has expanded the testing facilities that used to be mainly 3 into more than 10. And most of them have been done, some in partnership with private sector, but not directly. Private sector has supplied, and in some cases, even donated PCRs for testing. And that has enabled us test a large proportion of numbers. I mean, as I speak, I think we've tested more than 350,000 people, and we are continuing with testing. And yes, the impact of the private sector is being felt in the sudden acceleration in the tests. So it cannot be easily dismissed by any government, and that it is in the interest of every nation for that partnership and togetherness to work to bring alleviation, but also to solve the problems and look forward.
That's perfect. Thank you, Mr. Grant. Sorry, it's me coming back. I'm sure everybody who's in attendance is wondering where all these people are coming from and how many more there are. It's good to keep people on their toes, right? Thank you anyway, Mr. Grant, and thank you for the question, Kibret. I think it's
sorry, Owen, can I just put one more point which I forget to mention?
Okay. Yeah.
I think we must not also ignore the fact that the biggest pool of resources would be found in the private sector in any case. Whether it's capital or it's capacity and capability, it will be found in the private sector. So the private sector would be a natural catalyst into bringing solutions that are proposed by government, whether it's on raising capital or funding, whatever it is. So I think that is a point that we need to anchor strongly. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That's great. And I think you've all the panelists have spoken about the kind of opportunities that come with this public-private partnership, but also some of the challenges as well. Frank, there's a particular question that came to you, and I was interested in this as well, actually. You mentioned innovative finance, and I think it was interesting how you set the challenge for everybody to find another example apart from UCT of providing innovative finance programs in universities. The asker of the question was just wondering if you've got what you mean by innovative finance, I think, and whether you have any kind of particular examples that highlight what innovation means in this respect.
Well, I think when you talk about innovative financing, you're broadly talking about how you apply and mix different types of capital and investors into a common mutual platform of investment or opportunities around it. And you know, I think traditionally, for example, if you look at traditionally, a lot of our money coming to social investments was either tax collected by governments or aid that came as a loan. We used it, we paid back. I think just agreeing with what Mr. Grant said, there isn't enough money in the social investment space. So how do we get creative? How do we get innovative with the financing structures we put together? And we've got to look in the private sector to do this. And part of this, for example, is blending capital and how you blend grant capital that has zero expectation of financial returns and mainstream commercial capital in a common deal, for example. That's an example of where finance is deployed innovatively. So there's a case study, and I'm happy to share it here. One of the things we lack is we lack a lot of African case studies. One of the things we're hoping to do as AVPA is to build an alliance of universities that will not only collaborate in building capacity of African social investors, but also do research and build African case studies. But there's a case study in Mexico of a healthcare company that was providing diabetes care, but mainly in the cities. But there was huge diabetes incidence prevalence in the rural areas, but they thought it's too risky for them to go in the rural areas. So what happened was the grant maker, a certain donor grant maker, told them, okay, we'll bear the risk for you to go into the rural areas. We'll fund you for 3 years to go and build an office, hire people, and test a model of delivering your care in the rural areas. And these guys did it for 3 years, and they realized, actually, with a bit of tweaks, we can make money. And after 3 years, the donor exited, and these guys actually built out a model to go across the whole country. So that's an example, for example, of that kind of stuff. Another example is where loan guarantees are offered to banks so that they can reduce their risk of lending to small businesses and offer concessional loans to small businesses. So there are many types of instruments around innovative financing that can be applied, but we need people to be aware of those. We need people to be open to that. We need governments to have policies that encourage that kind of investment. So for example, in Africa, it's only in South Africa that you get tax rebates for donating to non-profits. I think other African governments need to look and see how they can do that kind of stuff. You look at outcome-based funding as a foundation. You can't play in an outcome-based facility as an investor. You can only play as an outcome investor. So, but we need to find the ways that also foundations now can generate some revenue in this new dispensation of innovative financing. So that's kind of the space we need to move into. But we need awareness, we need capacity, we need competence.
That's great, thank you. And it does remind me, I think another thing that's going to be coming out of the ICR facility is similarly an exploration of the kind of relationship between investment receivers and investment givers, and to really kind of take a fundamental look at how that exists in different contexts, because it's also something that has to, I think, kind of adapt and be tailored to a particular cultural context and the situation within different countries. So it'd be great to follow up in conversation with you about that as well.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm sure both of you will have a response on this, but I'll direct it to Christelle initially. There's a question here: as the impact investment movement is growing and collaboration is a must in this space, what is the view of the panel towards impact measurement and management? Are you all collaborating towards one methodology or framework, such as corporates getting behind shared value? And that's a question from Hital Sheth. I hope I've pronounced your name right. And I'll invite Christelle initially if she has anything in response to say to that. And hopefully she's still here.
Yes, I'm here. I know it's very difficult because I don't know if you're on, but yes, I'm here. So there are different ways how to measure the impact, and obviously depending on the angle that you're taking, we actually use different framework. So it kind of depends how you really measure that. Also, we're working a lot with investors, so our investors is also dictating the way they'd like to see the social the impact that has been created by their investment. So I know it's very broad, but it's a bit difficult to just say there's only one or two way to measure the impact. But a very important part of the investment coming from impact investor is to be able to report business. You can't just come up and say I've created 5 or 10 jobs, even 100 jobs. Usually that's not enough to show that you've actually created a very strong impact. That's my add on this.
Thank you. I guess a lot of the questions about kind of arriving at these shared indicators. I wonder, yes, Mr. Grant, I feel like you were about to say something.
Yes, the issue of measurement of impact is always, and once again, I refer to the concept of what that impact is on different sides of the divide, of the wealth and socialization divide, because impact in Africa may be conceptually totally different from impact in, for example, Sweden, Finland, or Norway, for that matter. And like I did say, that our whole development agenda is based on SDGs, largely in Africa. And on the corporate side, I suspect that strongly more investors are looking at what I call the triple bottom line, where there is benefit to the community that actually subscribes to the corporate's businesses. There is benefit to the shareholders, and then there's benefit to the company so that it sustains its business. So that triple bottom line, I suspect, would largely become the operating principle of most investors in the Africa, because they want to see impact. Now, what exactly is impact? And I look at impact on where it affects lives and livelihoods. And so in Africa, when you're talking of impacts, for example, it may be a large agricultural farm or it may be a small farm. It still has significant impact on the livelihoods of the people who live in the community where that farm is. And so what we've done in our budgetary process in Ghana is actually to have, should I say, a benchmarking of SDGs on the budget to see whether government's expenditure are achieving the objectives which are all geared towards SDGs. And I think that broadly, that's a very tenable way to look at it, so that government spends money in areas that really has impact. So if you're spending in education, what's the impact on education on the community in which it is being established? If you are putting out schools, how is it going to change their lives? How is it going to give them better livelihoods? How is it going to improve their chances of getting a great job? How is it going to improve their chances of having better health? And all those are some of the benchmarks that are actually taken in the budgeting process. So I think that in itself is a very important construct in the whole development ecosystem.
An international framework, yeah.
If I may just add to that a bit, I think also with Africa specifically, because of how far we're coming from to be able to get to where we need to go, I think there's huge need for also to focus on certain types of impact. There's a kind of impact that does no harm. It's almost a neutral impact where we'll maintain. We won't pollute the environment and that kind of stuff, but there's then the kind of impact that does some of the really heavy lifting around, like moving people off the poverty scale into kind of middle income status. So that really drives change, and I think Africa badly needs that second type of impact. That is just not maintaining the status quo, but is actually elevating the status of and the issues around social challenges we're facing. So I think as much as we possibly can, we need to focus kind of in that direction. But impact measurement is hard. There isn't a foolproof thing that's happening, but I know a lot of work is going into trying to find standardized metrics and frameworks around this.
I wonder if Kevin is still online, just so we could get a potential perspective from the Caribbean on this point as well. Kevin, are you still with us? May not be. I think he is, but I think he's otherwise engaged at the moment, I imagine. There is just one.
Yeah.
Okay. Kevin, here, please. Do you have any?
I was muted and with the camera off, so trying to do multiple things. So again, I have been listening. What was the question specifically?
We were talking about impact measurement and management, and the fact that in the impact investing space, there is a need for collaboration and some degree of agreement, one would imagine, around impact indicators, especially if this is going to involve public-private sector collaboration. I'm just wondering to what extent you think there is appetite, or that's already the case, I guess, within a Caribbean context.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think ESG has kind of it's the hot new thing. It's the flavor of the month, so to speak, and certainly how you define it, and to be able to sort of define what impact you expect to make in advance, and more importantly, to have the ability to look back and follow up that the impact that you expected to have been made has actually been done. So I think it's a new concept, particularly in the Caribbean, to move from just the airy concepts of ESG and SDGs to actually go through to measurement and proving your worth. So to me, and what I'm doing, it is very important that measurement aspect of it, and really it's with my partners in New York, 17 Asset Management, as the name implies, is really what they do in taking it from an investment from conceptualization through to the impact management, and being able to come back to our investors and stakeholders and saying, concretely, here's the result of what we've done. So yeah, we think it's really a critical step to kind of move it from just the flavor of the month, just a marketing ploy, to actually be able to make a concrete investment. And like within Africa, within the Caribbean, sort of attracting investments into the region in and of itself is making an impact. I mean, it makes impact over gender equality. It makes an impact in terms of access to finance, access to capital. So it's really, there's no distinction there. To be able to bring capital into a cash and capital starved environment is in and of itself making that positive impact. But again, being able to measure that and bring catalytic capital that can accelerate that is a big, is definitely a big deal.
Brilliant, thank you, Kevin. Now I'm very keen to try and end on the hour, and we do just have one sort of final thing to say at the end, but I do just want to give just a little bit of airtime to this question. So maybe Mr. Grant, I might direct it to you because I know it comes from somebody in Ghana, although it applies more broadly to Africa as well. It's from Edwin Kudjo, and I'm sorry again if I've pronounced your name a little bit wrong.
You got it right.
Great. Thank you. The question is, what is the level of commitment from governments across Africa in promoting social enterprise and impact investing policies? And I know from the British Council perspective, we often try to focus on the enabling environment, as many organisations do, for impact investment and this channeling of finance towards social enterprise to run as smoothly as possible. So I wonder whether there are proactive policies there across Africa, or whether there's still work to be done in that respect.
To be honest and realistically, I still think that there is a bit of work to be done. But I also posit that amount of work that needs to be done is based on the real confusions of the separation of social impact from economic and development impact. Because for us, I keep saying that they're one and the same. So in Ghana, for example, we have a saying that if you educate a man, you educate an individual. If you educate a woman, you educate a family. That's significant impact. So there is a great effort into women and girl child education. That's impact. So the government in itself, like I did say, is benchmarking these in its budget. And that's a commitment it has, that social and impact investment have a critical role to play in the whole development ecosystem. And therefore, I dare say that, yes, Ghana, it's clearly there. I think that commitment is there. And there is also a little bit much less. And I think the whole concept of impact and social investment has always sort of evolved out of the smaller community-sized investments. But it's these small microcosmic investments that make up the larger development story. And therefore, I think that most African economies have focused on the larger picture without percolating it down to say, okay, how at the micro level are we going to translate policy into real development, both human, infrastructure, and social? And I think that's a big challenge. But invariably, what you're going to see is that in almost every country's development agenda, you will see the concepts of SDGs actually expressed in many ways, whether it's in education, whether it's in health, whether it's in water, whether it's in partnerships. And for me, that's my favorite SDG, number 17, partnerships, because those partnerships will help us largely eliminate SDG 1, which is poverty.
Perfect. Thank you. I feel like that's a really good note to end on in terms of the substantive content. Thank you. I think the partnerships, like you say, it's kind of partnerships and scaling, operating across all sorts of different scales, from the macro scale to the small scale, but also geographically across sectors and so on and so forth. So that's great. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm aware that we're rapidly running out of time. So I would just like to say a massive, massive thank you to all of our panel members. It's been so great to hear from you all. I think there's been a really good mix of perspectives. I think we've covered a lot in what is a fairly short time in the grand scheme of things. And I think there's lots for people to go away with and think a little bit more about. I would also say and highlight again that in follow-up to this session, we do have the opportunity for people to request support through virtual one-to-one clinics from our experts, Bonnie and Sarah Jane, who thank you to both of you as well for facilitating this session and bringing the panels together and the content. So there's information about those one-to-one sessions on your screens at the moment. They are for organizations from Africa, Caribbean and Pacific countries. They are for organizations that have a mandate to influence and affect the investment climate and the business environment within ACP countries. And you have until the 30th of July to register your interest in receiving support through those clinics by emailing ICR Facility at giz.de. Please, in that email, indicate your organization and the particular questions and issues that you'd like to address. And those sessions are available in both English and French. There isn't too much more to be said, except that the presentation should be available for download, or there's certainly some information available for download in the handouts section of your navigation panel, hopefully on the right-hand side of your screens. I'm sure if the presentation itself isn't available for download there, it will be in follow-up emails and correspondence. And finally, I think after this slide, after I've closed, I think the slide will turn to a final poll just to get your feedback on how useful this was. So please do bear with us and fill in that poll, and we look forward to engaging with you all in the future. Thank you for joining, and take care.